Hey guys, I'm Andrew the Geek Master, and today we're continuing the story Leveling with the Gods. This is the story of a guy using an RPG-style system to become a god and take down all the gods that destroyed his world. I'll drop a link to the playlist with all the videos in the cards and pinned comment. If you don't want to miss stories like this, hit that subscribe button, ring the bell, and let's get started. The last chapter ended with our protagonist, Yu Won, planning to sell each of his essences for 100 points, but Myung-hoon confronted him, asking what he would do if people didn't have the money. Yu Won just smiled. He wasn't forcing anyone to buy anything. Those without points could borrow money from others or even sell their items to the lackey. People who were desperate due to having few points started whispering to each other. They hadn't even realized they could sell their items, weapons, and even attribute points. Myung-hoon knew no one would agree to that. He even started accusing Yu Won of killing and stealing essences from others. The couple Yu Won had helped earlier quickly came to his defense. They had been with Yu Won and hadn't been harmed at all. In fact, this is when Ju Yeon revealed that it was Myung-hoon who had killed their friends and forced them to run away to avoid being killed too. Myung-hoon intimidatingly said that just 3 people wouldn't be able to do anything against a crowd, which started to move all at once. In fact, under Myung-hoon's orders, everyone rushed towards our protagonist, drawing their swords, knives, spears, and axes to attack him. But at that moment, Yu Won stood up. As soon as 2 of them crossed the line Yu Won had drawn on the ground, he pulled out his knife, and a fountain of blood erupted. The 2 men were simply decapitated as Yu Won said openly that they crossed the line. Myung-hoon was confused by what had just happened. He was in shock, seeing blood spurting everywhere. It was definitely not Yu Won's blood. It was the blood of the people who attacked Yu Won. And to make matters worse, at that moment, Kim Myung-hoon remembered something Yu Won had said a few days earlier at the start of the 3rd tutorial, that he shouldn't cross the line. While looking at the dead bodies on the ground, Yu Won reminded everyone that he wasn't forcing anybody to do anything. Then he activated the basic arcane sword and added that anyone who crossed the line with any other intention would certainly die. There were less than 20 minutes left before the gate was activated. By this point, almost everyone was gathered around the gate. Myung-hoon gritted his teeth. He didn't want to accept it, but he was furious because he had also been intimidated by Yu Won and once again ordered his men to kill him. The truth is, Yu Won knew something like this would happen. Everyone had gathered there to steal essence from one another, so of course, there would be more people willing to take it by force rather than pay fairly. What followed was a true massacre. Heads upon heads flew through the air before falling to the ground. It was the strength of a single individual taking down a group. Everyone who died had their inventory deleted instantly, meaning their essences disappeared too, so no one could take them. At this point, Myung-hoon's lackeys started hesitating. It was clear to them that they couldn't defeat Yu Won. Yu Won's knife dripped blood everywhere, completely covering the circle and its surroundings. Yu Won had already killed 20 men, filling Myung-hoon with terror. Here, we learn that Myung-hoon was still at level 12, and he couldn't believe that Yu Won was cutting off people's heads while dodging every attack directed at him. That's when he remembered that this world was different. A world where there were attributes, levels, items, and skills. It was a world like a video game. Someone high level with high stats and powerful items couldn't be defeated by dozens or even hundreds of low-level noobs. That's why, subconsciously, he backed away from Yu Won and people stopped attacking Yu Won completely. He realized that from the beginning of the fight, Yu Won hadn't taken a single step outside the circle. So he kept trying to back away, believing Yu Won wouldn't kill him as long as he didn't cross the line. But then he looked up and saw that time seemed to have almost frozen. In the slow flow of time, Myung-hoon looked at Yu Won. His body wobbled and suddenly Yu Won was upside down. The sky and ground swapped places in his field of vision, and the world went white. He no longer had the strength to hold his body. Myung-hoon collapsed on the ground. Before losing consciousness, he managed to lift his head a little, and in his blurry vision, he saw it clearly. Yu-won had just cut off his head. He had stepped out of the circle with a smile on his face, stating that he had memorized the faces of all of them. After the massive carnage that took place, Yu-won simply picked up his box containing thousands of essences and moved to a spot with less blood. Seeing this, the man who had tried to negotiate with Myung-hoon mustered up some courage and raised his hand, saying he wanted to buy some essences. He sold his own knife for 500 points to get the 7 essences he needed. His friend still wanted to stick to the plan of stealing essences from others, but Yu-won's arrival had really changed everything. He finally understood how Yu-won had been able to collect so many essences. He had hunted countless monsters to drastically increase his level. Not to mention, Yu-won had just proven himself to be an honorable man. To convince the rest of the people to buy his essences, he hadn't stolen anything from anyone. Plus, with his display of power, he showed the crowd that all his essences had been earned fairly through monster hunting. Anyway, as soon as the first trade was made and the man got his 50 essences, he crossed the portal. After that, the street turned into a marketplace. Yu-won counted in his head as he sold his essences. People were busy calling their lackeys to sell the items they'd bought. While selling his essences, Yu-won watched the negotiations between the participants and the lackeys that showed up. In the tutorial shop, there was a return function. It was a way to get back the points you'd spent by reselling the items you were using in the shop. Then, the lackeys would take the items they bought back and sell them to participants in the next tutorial. It was a kind of cycle. However, this function was rarely used by any participant because most lackeys were basically thieves. The participants expressed their anger at the prices offered by the lackeys. Items that had been bought for 1,000 points were now being offered for only 300 or 400 points, some even as low as 200 points. Others were even selling their attributes for a measly 100 points. Sure, losing a few points in perception or constitution might not seem like a big deal now, but in the long run, it was a huge loss. After climbing even a few floors of the tower, they would realize just how valuable the attribute points they'd given up were. Anyway, the sales progressed smoothly until the end, and with that, our protagonist managed to collect 167,400 points. Even inside the tower, that was a huge amount. In fact, it shouldn't have been possible to earn that many points in the tutorial, but now it was. When Yu-won stood up, Ju-yeon, who had been waiting by his side, asked if he was finally going to enter the portal. Yu-won turned his head to look at her and noticed that Song-chan was also waiting for him. Even though it had only been a day, Ju-yeon and Song-chan were following Yu-won. Yu-won shook his head and made it clear that he had no intention of making any companions here. The couple even said that he didn't have to consider them his companions, that they were fine being used as pawns again, and that if Yu-won thought they were no longer useful, he could just leave them behind. A smile formed on Yu-won's face. It was true that hunting had been much easier thanks to the two of them. However, that didn't mean they could walk the same path as him. There were almost no humans who could walk alongside Yu-won. Without extraordinary talent, it was impossible to follow where Yu-won was going, let alone walk beside him. Naturally, this applied to Ju-yeon and Seong-chan. The two of them should be more than capable of passing the tutorial and entering the tower, but that would be the limit of their abilities. Yu-won, on the other hand, was aiming to reach the top of the tower. No, maybe even higher. As a final tip, Yu-won told them not to try clinging to someone else, or they wouldn't last long. Yu-won shrugged when he saw the disappointed expressions on his former companions' faces and said that even if he wanted to go with them, he couldn't, because he wasn't moving forward. Ju-yeon and Seong-chan were confused, and when Yu-won opened his inventory, it was revealed that he didn't have any essences left. Juyan and Seong-chan were stunned. They had assumed he had saved some for himself. But Yuan repeated his words, making them understand that when he said he wasn't moving forward, he meant he had no intention of passing on to the next tutorial. He even told them to hurry, because soon this place would become a true hell. Juyan and Seong-chan hesitated for a moment longer, but seeing that our protagonist was very determined and there was nothing they could do, they entered the portal. With business concluded, Yuan stood up and stretched his arms. Since there was still about an hour and a half left, he started recalling how the tutorial was structured, compared to the various missions required to climb the tower. The first was survival, the second was competition, the third was hunting, and the fourth was defense. Since so many people had crossed over, the next tutorial shouldn't be too hard for those two. Suddenly, Yuan was approached by a middle-aged man wearing glasses, wanting to know if he had already sold all the essences. When Yuan nodded, the man collapsed to the ground after hearing the answer. Others had similar reactions. After observing them for a moment, Yuan left, as there was no reason for him to stay any longer. About 20 people were left. Yuan knew they would soon start fighting among themselves to steal each other's essences. About half of them would survive, while the other half would die. And Yuan had no intention of intervening and deciding who would live or die. That's why Yuan left. As soon as the main player in the middle of the crowd disappeared, the people began to move, but Yuan didn't have time to pay attention to what they were doing. There was only about an hour left. Our protagonist simply said the word shop, and his words created a rupture out of thin air. This was a normal phenomenon when a lackey appeared during the tutorial. However, this rupture was much larger than Yuan expected. At that moment, a familiar figure emerged from the massive rupture, and to Yuan's surprise, it was the tutorial administrator. What Yuan needed was the shop, and for that, he required the help of a lackey. Unlike the tower, it was impossible to use the shop during the tutorial without a lackey. And the reason for the administrator's appearance was that right now, they were recruiting some newcomers since they had lost a lot of people. About 1 in 3 lackeys had a connection to Olympus. Additionally, thanks to Yuan's brilliant idea of trading essences for points, over 100 people were using the shop simultaneously, causing some lackeys to get stuck in this sector, leading to delays in other sectors. But of course, the main reason for the administrator's presence was Yuan himself, who had become a special administrative target. Because of that, he required supervision for truly standing out and showing strange behaviors. Anyway, according to the administrator, with Yuan's current level and his point total, he now had enough power to destroy the entire tutorial environment. Yuan responded that this was exactly what he wanted, which left the administrator speechless, seeing Yuan's brazen attitude. With no time to keep talking, Yuan requested the shop, and the administrator extended his hand to Yuan, opening his palm. From his palm, which was about the size of Yuan's head, the shop catalog opened. After browsing the catalog for 30 minutes, Yuan nodded. Since he was still in the tutorial, the shop didn't have all the skills and items Yuan was familiar with. So after seeing most of what was for sale, he had a good idea of what he should buy. First, he spent 10,000 points to buy the mid-level personal inventory. Then he spent 50,000 points to buy the Arctic Steel Sword, a sword that gave off a cold aura. After that, he bought the Pyromancy Cloak for 60,000 points, which was a crimson silk robe enchanted with ancient magic and made of a special material. He even spent 20,000 points to purchase the Magic Nullification Shield. The administrator grew increasingly curious because these items were usually meant for the higher floors of the tower. But here was our protagonist with the cloak draped over his shoulders and wielding the shield after spending a total of 140,000 points. Additionally, he also bought 5 ice crystals, which were basically crystal balls formed in extremely cold atmospheres. And to finish, he spent 2,000 points to buy a well-sharpened sword. Within Yuan's reach, a fine-looking sword with a black hilt appeared. Yuan donned his crimson cloak and then tried out his new sword. It fit perfectly in his hand and seemed to have decent mana conductivity. With the purchases completed, the administrator said that not a single tutorial participant should be able to stand against him now. The participants didn't have what it took to pierce that cloak. But with a questionable smile, the administrator also said that this only applied to participants. While Yuan was a bit surprised to hear these words, the administrator left, claiming he was looking forward to the future. Yuan understood that the administrator already knew what Yuan's plans were, but that didn't matter, because at that very moment, the system announced that the third tutorial was finished. Everyone who hadn't crossed the portal, including Yuan, had failed the tutorial. As if that wasn't enough, the system also warned that the sector annihilation would begin immediately, and indeed, the horde of monsters vanished, and the bizarre plants wrapped around the buildings disappeared while the buildings returned to their original appearance. The sky turned scarlet, and the temperature suddenly spiked. Fortunately, Yuan didn't feel much heat. Thanks to the pyromancy cloak, whose effect was increased fire resistance, his body was protected from the infernal heat that began to rise. The same couldn't be said for the 3 survivors who hadn't made it through the portal. Yuan could hear screaming and crying in the distance. He turned his head toward the noise and started walking in their direction. He couldn't feel the heat, but he could still tell that this place was getting hotter and hotter. The 3 people were confused to see Yuan. No one could have expected Yuan, of all people, to have failed the tutorial. He was skilled enough to have gathered over 1,000 essences, far more than the 50 required. Yuan looked at their faces. They seemed to want something from him. If they wanted to be saved, that was a useless request. They were already drenched in sweat, their bodies unable to handle the heat. Suddenly, the ground trembled, and the temperature reached its peak. The ground split, and flames rose from the cracks. Heat waves continued to surge from the ground until finally one man caught fire. Not long after, the woman next to him also burst into flames. As they screamed for help, Yuan thought of the ice crystals in his inventory. But the truth was, these people were already dead. Everything was burning and there was nowhere to escape. However, this world wasn't called annihilation because of a little fire and brimstone. The system sent another message saying that the 176th giant would begin. With that, a long, skeletal hand emerged from the fissure in the ground. The hand was engulfed in flames, and the owner of the hand struggled out of the ground. It was a moving skeleton with barely any flesh left. It wore clothes made of flames and held a torch in one hand. It was a trash-class demon, a skeleton. And it wasn't alone. Along with the flames, thin bones continued to emerge from the cracked earth. Hundreds and thousands of skeletons appeared. Despite the number, our protagonist didn't show any signs of weakness or fear, because although there were many, these weren't the real deal. Our protagonist was looking for a specific monster, and that's when the ground rumbled and all the skeletons stopped and looked in the direction of something unknown. This was Suruhtra, a low-class demon and the 176th child of Surtar from Norse mythology. Yuan smiled as he greeted the creature that turned the landscape into a hellish inferno with its mere presence. The first time Yuan encountered Suruhtra was during the myth of annihilation, Ragnarok. The detail is that in their first meeting, Suruhtra was as large as a mountain, but here he was the size of a house. With a skull for a face and a magma-red body, Suruhtra wielded a giant flaming sword. He looked to the sky with great pride and arrogance. Suruhtra was the embodiment of annihilation that had descended upon the tutorial sector. But Yuan, who seemed as small as a mouse compared to the giant, quickly reminded him that he was among the weakest of Surtur's children, even though in terms of appearance, he was the most like him. When Suruhtra turned his head, he was surprised to see that Yuan had the same eyes as him. Yuan immediately knew who Suruhtra was referring to when he said him, as Yuan currently possessed the eyes of the Monkey King. Suruhtra gave a wicked smile, probably recalling an old memory. The ground then rose, forming a giant chair of flames. Suruhtra used magic to create a throne for himself, so he could sit and watch Yuan fight. Once the demon had seated himself in his resting place, he raised his flaming sword high, and all the skeletons around began to close in on Yuan. And once they were close enough, Yuan's new item, the well-sharpened sword, shattered the skull of a skeleton. And at the same time, the skeleton's body exploded, and a black flame engulfed Yuan. Suruhtra couldn't help but commend Yuan for taking down a skeleton with a single blow. As the smoke from the explosion subsided and Yuan emerged from the dark clouds unscathed, Suruhtra realized that a normal person would have been burned to death from that explosion, but Yuan's level and constitution were already far beyond that of a normal person, reaching the level of a superhuman. Furthermore, the pyromancy cloak nullified the heat from the skeleton's explosion and even gained additional resistance to fire attribute attacks. This, of course, meant that trash-class demons like skeletons couldn't harm Yuan with their flames. Suruhtra recognized what Yuan was wearing. He even asked if Yuan had prepared specifically to face him, but our protagonist's response couldn't have been better. As he advanced toward the army of skeletons, he claimed that he had indeed prepared to defeat him. Suruhtra couldn't stop laughing at Yuan's reckless and arrogant words, but at the same time, he couldn't stand the idea of sitting on his throne and just watching Yuan's advances. So, without wasting time, our protagonist began to attack the skeletons, which weren't very agile and didn't have particularly high defense. They weren't too dangerous for him, so he started rotating his ankles while looking at the horde of skeletons. Yuan jumped into the middle of the horde and spun. Using the momentum of his sword, he whirled like a Beyblade. In an instant, several skeletons were cut down. A series of explosions followed, and dense smoke once again enveloped Yuan. But from within the smoke, Yuan leaped out holding a massive shield. The magic nullification shield had excellent resistance to magic and was one of the items Yuan specifically bought to protect himself in this fight. After defeating many of these skeletons over the course of about 2 hours, he leveled up 3 more times, increasing his dexterity, constitution, and arcane power, a pleasant message to hear as always. Of course, breathing this hot air for 2 hours made him feel a bit irritated. Not to mention, while the skeletons didn't have particularly strong attacks, their post-death explosions were problematic, not because they caused significant damage, but because they were unavoidable, and the magic nullification shield was almost at its limit, needing repairs. As he looked at the greatly diminished horde of skeletons, Yuan spoke to Suruhtra for the first time in 2 hours, telling him to come down here and send the weaklings away. Yuan's words caused the red vein on Suruhtra's forehead to twitch. Yuan had gotten so close to Suruhtra that he could reach him whenever he wanted. At that, Suruhtra finally stopped resting his chin on his arm and stood up. He jumped, and in a flash, Suruhtra's giant body landed directly in front of Yuan. The ground trembled. After descending from his throne, Suruhtra swung the gigantic sword onto his shoulder. Placing his sword in front of Yuan, he was quite curious to know how he had acquired these items in the tutorial. Staring at Suruhtra up close, Yuan felt a much greater pressure than before, while Suruhtra acknowledged him as someone worthy, capable of climbing the tower and becoming a ranker. Even so, Yuan emphasized that he was only here to defeat Suruhtra, which made the powerful being burst into laughter. Suruhtra raised his giant sword to the sky. Yuan looked up at the sword. The demon's flame-wrapped sword seemed hot enough to burn everything in the world to ashes. Then Yuan clenched his teeth and raised his shield. He had already accumulated enough fire aura within his body and was ready to finish it all. As Surutra's sword began to descend, the magic nullification shield started showing more fractures, and indeed the shield shattered, and Surutra's flaming sword came down directly on Yuan, smashing him into the ground. Yuan braced his body to try to withstand it, but the ground beneath him began to give way, and unable to bear the pressure, the ground finally collapsed. Thus, in the middle of Hongdae, a giant hole was created. At that moment, we have a flashback to a conversation Yuan had with the Monkey King, where it's revealed that Yuan lost several times to Sun Wukong. The main reason for these defeats was his eyes. Sun Wukong explained how he obtained those eyes. For some reason, he failed the third tutorial and faced annihilation, so he told Yuan how he got those eyes, which our protagonist is now trying to obtain. Back in the present, Suruhtra looked at the hole created by the flaming sword. The hole was burning with crimson fire. This fire would never die unless Suruhtra ran out of energy. Suruhtra thought that, no matter how great his items were, Yuan should have either died or at least been severely injured. But Suruhtra had the impression that Yuan had purposely accepted the attack instead of dodging. In that instant, from within the pit of fire, Yuan slowly emerged, his body completely burned. While exhaling the fiery aura formed within his body, Yuan looked at Suruhtra, and when their eyes met, Suruhtra's eyes widened. That's because his irises had turned red. Yuan had just fulfilled the conditions for the secret piece. The second stage of the monkey eyes, called the Ashen eyes, a rank A skill. These eyes, synchronized with the demon's fire, were capable of discerning good from evil, as well as truth from lies. Yuan even thanked Suruhtra because now the power of the great god had descended upon Yuan's eyes. According to the skill's description, it also had strong fire resistance, sensory amplification, and battle foresight. The only way to awaken the Ashen eyes was to swallow a demon's fire in a secret part of the tutorial and imbue it into one's eyes. This made Yuan respect the Monkey King even more because he only withstood the pain of the flames thanks to his equipment, whereas Sun Wukong, without any special items, was able to hold his ground against Suruhtra until he obtained the Ashen eyes. Still, Suruhtra couldn't stop smiling. Yuan's body was covered in burns, not to mention that he was unable to dispel the fire aura within his body. However, Yuan consumed 2 of those ice crystals he had bought, which caused his body temperature to drop significantly and neutralized his burn status. He also equipped himself with the Arctic Steel Sword, which seemed like a touch would freeze anything, so much so that it had a side effect of slowly freezing the user. The extreme heat and the terrible burns covering Yuan disappeared. But in their place, a deep cold took over his body to the point where the ice attribute was added to his arcane power. Now Yuan possessed a power that was the exact opposite of Suruhtra's fire. Suruhtra shuddered at the aura emanating from the sword. He realized that the aura coming from Yuan and the sword could actually hurt him. Now that Yuan had obtained the Ashen eyes, it was finally time to defeat Suruhtra. Yuan stepped firmly as Suruhtra's sword came down on him. A giant flame engulfed Yuan, but instead of trying to dodge, he swung his sword against the fire. This was an attack that just moments ago had broken the magic nullification shield and nearly killed Yuan. However, in a short span of time, things had changed significantly. All of his items resisted Suruhtra's flames of annihilation. With that, Yuan managed to carve a path through the flames for himself. Jumping into the air, Yuan entered Suruhtra's personal space near his waist and slashed Suruhtra's torso, splitting his armor of fire. Suruhtra screamed in agony. Normally, something like this would be impossible, because no one could pierce Suruhtra's armor of fire, even with high strength and arcane power attributes. However, Yuan managed to do exactly that, thanks to the power of the Arctic Steel Sword and the ice crystals. Suruhtra was furious, his body slowly turning black, and from within his hand, a crimson and black infernal flame materialized. The onyx-colored flame was definitely a threat, and Yuan knew he had to dodge this attack. Then, Yuan's vision was tinged red, thanks to the power of the Ashen eyes. And within his vision, a path was outlined. He could sense it instinctively. That's where he had to move. It was one of the powers of the Ashen eyes, battle foresight. Suruhtra's black flames began incinerating the entire area. The black flames were different from the normal fire that had been there just a moment ago. Instead of just burning the ground, these flames were capable of completely melting the earth. Fortunately, Yuan managed to avoid being incinerated by the black flames, though he didn't escape completely unscathed. He tried to dissipate the heat with the Arctic steel sword, but it didn't work. He still wasn't strong enough to fight Suruhtra, so he consumed 3 more ice crystals, which caused his body temperature to drop again, and our protagonist knew he couldn't hold out much longer. As he exhaled, Suruhtra's sword descended upon him, and the black flames split the earth. Yuan twisted his body, dodging the attack. Moving away from the molten ground, Yuan rushed toward Suruhtra. He jumped at Suruhtra's legs since he was running out of time and no longer had the luxury of conserving mana. Yuan managed to make a clean cut on Suruhtra's leg because the arcane sword extended a few centimeters beyond the Arctic steel sword. Suruhtra screamed in agony. Losing his balance from the loss of a leg, Suruhtra fell to his knees with a thud. Searching for Yuan, Suruhtra quickly lifted his head, but before he could find him, a white ball of mana ice flew straight at Suruhtra's face. It was a mana explosion reinforced with the power of the ice crystals. It hit Suruhtra's face directly, and the demon's flaming head froze in an instant. This caused Suruhtra to lose his balance, but it didn't last long. Fire burst from Suruhtra's head once again. Suruhtra may have had a weakness against ice, but the power gap between Suruhtra and Yuan was too large. But for Yuan, disrupting Suruhtra's balance for just a moment was more than enough. With the power of the Ashen eyes, the world seemed to slow down. Suruhtra's swaying body was definitely large, but not impossible to climb, so Yuan scaled Suruhtra's back. Feeling Yuan standing on his neck, Suruhtra shook his head, calling him an insolent brat who hadn't even climbed the tower yet. That's when the flames of annihilation began to spread across Suruhtra's body. It was a fire mixed with the black hellfire, the fire that would destroy this tutorial. And Yuan wasn't yet at a level where he could handle these flames. Yuan had prepared several countermeasures against Suruhtra's fire. However, even with all those preparations, his body was still being burned. This was the power of the annihilation of the 3rd tutorial, and the difference in power level between Yuan and Suruhtra. Yet Yuan still managed to climb onto Suruhtra's head. The lower-class demon Suruhtra had only one fatal weakness. Yuan wielded his Arctic steel sword, and Suruhtra screamed as he realized Yuan had managed to climb onto his head. Yuan's sword plunged deep into Suruhtra's head and slowly released its icy aura into Suruhtra. And thus the Arctic steel sword, forged from pure ice, shattered, and the flames of annihilation on Suruhtra's body were extinguished. The system soon confirmed that Yuan had defeated the annihilation of the tutorial. Our protagonist was overjoyed. He had actually managed to defeat him. While leveling up from the experience he gained, he reminisced about his old friends but knew this was only the beginning. And when the system announced that he had unlocked an unthinkable achievement, with the reward calculation still pending, Yuan could only smile, saying that this was going to be a great journey. I hope you all enjoyed today's video, and please leave a comment about what you think of this story and what you thought of the epic battle between our protagonist and the demon Suruhtra. To catch the continuation, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, hit the notification bell, and leave a like to help support us. Thanks for watching, and see you on the next adventure.